the airlines can't use hydrogen planes unless the airport that it takes off from and the airport that it lands at can do with hydrogen. So we have to work together, right? And it's a really interesting point. And so the approach that we take at Gatwick is we want to be jet zero ready. And what we mean by that is when an airline, be it EasyJet or whoever, says, right, we're going to start using hydrogen planes in 2038, and I'm just making these numbers up, dates up, we need to make sure that if they want to do it by 2030, we're ready. Then we can supply them either with the hydrogen or the electricity that they want to use.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Mark Edwards, the head of sustainability for London Gatwick Airport. Leading sustainability for one of Europe's 10 largest airports, he has quite a hill to climb because he has announced that London Gatwick will hit net zero by 2030. Mark and I dive into exactly what it takes to make a large airport like London Gatwick go net zero. So Mark, welcome to the podcast as the head of sustainability for one of Europe's 10 biggest airport, London Gatwick. You've announced that you will hit net zero not by 2050, not by 2040, by 2030. Can you tell us what this ambitious goal entails and how you will get there?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. It's actually reasonably straightforward and in some ways a bit dull, to be honest. So our net zero target is only for scopes 1 and 2. So that's for essentially fuels that we burn on site and electricity and heat that we buy. So for scope 2, we buy renewable electricity. So through the market-based accounting, that allows us to count that as zero emissions. So that's quite a straightforward thing to be able to do. And I think we've been doing that since 2014. So we've been doing that for quite a few years. So in terms
Has there been so much renewable energy or electricity around Gatwick that you are able to buy this since 2014?
So we buy it from the national grid, and we use REGOs, renewable electricity guarantees of origin. So we know.
Oh, so that's like a book and claim.
Yeah.
So it's not that every single bulb at Gatwick is powered by renewable electricity, but what you've paid for is paying for renewable electricity somewhere.
Yes, so so we are able to claim through the accounting processes and the certificates that Gatwick is powered by renewable electricity. So so that then leaves us, in terms of net zero, that then just leaves us with scope 1. So essentially, we just need to stop burning stuff. So what that means is no more natural gas, no more diesel, no more petrol, etc., etc. So what that really means is we use natural gas for heating, and that's a vast proportion of our scope 1 emissions. So we've got over 100 boilers that will need to be changed to a variety of different technologies, whatever it might be. So that'll get rid of natural gas. Then in terms of sort of petrol and diesel, we have a vehicle fleet of around 400 plus vehicles. So we'll be gradually changing those vehicles over to electric vehicles. So we're doing that in line with the asset life cycle. So we're not replacing vehicles prematurely. And also as we do that, we'll be transitioning, I think it's next month, to using HVO for diesel vehicles, which will have a huge impact on the emissions, but that's as a transition step to going full EV. So we won't be changing all 400 vehicles in one go. So as we do it, so our use of HVO will will replace diesel, but also it will decline as we move to electrics. So those are the two big things.
Is HVO like cooking oil being reused? Is that what it is?
Yes. So basically, it's we are only going to be using HVO derived from waste products. So essentially, in some ways, we'll send a big van down to a chippy in Crawley, get their old oil, and then use it to power vehicles. I mean, it's slightly more complicated than that. It's like bigger scale, but broadly, it's waste oil. Yeah.
So I'm curious about this then. So it is the life cycle emissions of the vehicle that is reducing, not necessarily what comes out of the exhaust pipe, in my understanding.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's the diesel, the fuels, and the natural gas. And then there's two more components. There's or three more actually. There's refrigeration, which is the other side of cooling. So when you use air conditioning units use things called F gases, and F gases are greenhouse gases. So they're only a problem when they escape into the atmosphere. So these are called fugitive emissions. Now, the trouble is, all refrigeration systems, aircon systems, they're all mechanical systems. They will break down, and so there will be emissions because no machine is 100% effective. So the approach we're adopting is kind of a two-stroke approach around quality and quantity. So in terms of quality, where we can, we want to replace the F gases with F gases that have a lower global warming potential. So when they do leak, they will have a lower impact. And so unfortunately, there aren't F gases that exist currently. The technology doesn't exist where F gases have zero GWP, so they have no impact. But we can try and replace those gases where we can and where it's viable to use those gases that have a lower impact when they leak. So that's the quality side of things. And then in terms of quantity, effectively, we need to try and sort out our leaks. So we need to have a really good leak detection system, and then we need to be able to go and fix those leaks as soon as possible. So when we do get a leak, we'll stop it and reduce the quantity of emissions as soon as possible. And then also through kind of a proactive maintenance schedule, we'll try and decrease the number of leaks. So that's the other thing we're doing. And there's a couple of bits. We also have to do fire training. So the fire crews on the airport have to be trained, and their training involves them setting light to things and putting it out. So burning stuff means you have emissions. So that's quite difficult because obviously I assume that everyone would want their fire crews effectively trained. So we're trying to, that's a really thorny subject to work out, well, hang on, how do we stop burning stuff? How do we, because we've got to do this training. So we're sort of looking at options around there, but it's a bit limited. And then we have another source of emissions from de-icer. So particularly cold as it is in the UK, we use de-icer on the airfield and some of our assets. So for example, we have a monorail going between the two terminals. So we use de-icer on that. And so when de-icer breaks down, it creates GHGs. So we're looking for alternatives for that. But again, those last few things is kind of, we're looking for the technological solutions. So that, in a nutshell, although quite a big nutshell, is what we're doing to address net zero.
Wow. So that is a lot of operational details that are coming in. I have one question. These ground vehicles you talked about, do you own them, or are these owned and operated by operators like Swissport or Danata?
Yeah. So our target is only around the vehicles that Gatwick Airport Limited owns and operates. So that's about 400 vehicles. So most of them will be kind of road-going type vehicles. There'll be some other operational bits of kit.
Wow. Okay. This is very interesting. Now, how does this all tie into the ACI, Airport Carbon Accreditation, ACA standard, that you have achieved the highest level of? How's this been helping you work towards and benchmark your net zero goals?
So what's interesting is that we've got ACI level 4 plus, which is transition, and the plus just means that we can be carbon neutral, so we offset residual emissions. So that was the highest level of the ACA until COP28 when they announced level 5. which I think only 2 or 3 airports have got. They've just launched it at COP28. And level 5 is that push to get to net zero and demonstrate that. So in terms of sort of how that helps, it kind of, I think the ACI system is good in that it is international. So it covers all airports. So you can kind of compare and contrast when it's a level playing field. So it's really interesting to understand what others are doing, and then sort of almost benchmark for yourselves and see where we could look at improvements. But equally, the ACI system, there is there's a spectrum of performance. So you've got some airports which are maybe starting out on their journey, and so they'll be at the lower, the lower levels, but that's fine, and then you've got people like Gatwick and other airports that are levels 4 and 5, which are the higher end. So every airport will be on a spectrum, and I think it's good that the ACI framework, the ACI system sets out that framework for increasingly addressing carbon and gives a good path for airports to follow.
It's very interesting. So when you say benchmarking, where do you think Gatwick is compared to someone like Edmonton or Schiphol, which often come up when it comes to some of these sustainability ratings?
Well, it's interesting. So the ACA is the airport carbon accreditation. So it's only looking at carbon. And obviously carbon is just one issue as part of the wider sustainability agenda. So that's, in terms of looking purely at our carbon performance, I think the ACA gives a good benchmark to allow comparison. So, if you look at all the airports, so it's all publicly available. If you go to the ACA website, you'll see all the airports listed under the various levels that they've achieved. So, so if you were to look at the level 4 plus, it would be reasonable to say, should you go to any of those airports, you probably have a similar experience of just purely in terms of carbon. You would expect it to be quite similar. But then the wider sustainability thing is absolutely, sustainability is all about context. And again, you've got a broad spectrum of performance. And because it's around context, and airports are in different geographical, they're in different locations. So each airport will have different subjects which are really important to it, which are more material. So the way in which sustainability is addressed, although there are lots of common themes, noise, surface access, air quality, all carbon, all of these are common themes, but the actual context for each airport will be slightly different. So that is actually, if you're talking about comparing sustainability performance in the round, that is a lot harder to do, and you have to sort of look at things with a little bit more nuance, I think.
That's very interesting. Now, when you started, you mentioned that net zero is as it relates to scope 1 and scope 2.
Yep.
What's interesting is, as you know, a vast majority of aviation's climate impact comes from your airline customers, which is scope 3 for you, scope 1 for airlines. And as far as public is concerned, it's not airports or airlines, it's just travel. We're just traveling. We just happen to start at an airport, end at an airport, and in the middle there's the airline. What do you say to critics who might claim that what an airport like yours does is, in the greater scheme of things, unimportant, whereas airlines continue to burn large amounts of carbon?
So it's a really interesting question, and agree with you that the perception is people don't make the difference between the different stakeholders in the aviation industry. But I think it's important that the aviation industry as a whole is trying to take action. And I think it's important that each stakeholder plays its part and does what it can. So absolutely agree with you. Well over 90% of Gatwick's carbon footprint, that we measure through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, is scope 3 emissions. Those are things that we can't control. So absolutely, yes. And the biggest one is absolutely related to flights. Completely acknowledge that. But what can Gatwick do? Because Gatwick is part of the ecosystem of aviation. So what can Gatwick do to play its role? And so by setting ourselves our net zero target by 2030 for scope 1 and 2, we're basically saying, right, we're going to try and do our bit. These are things that we can control. And it's about, in some ways, it's about Gatwick walking the walk so that we can talk the talk. So that if we are able to demonstrate that we're doing everything we can, although agreed that may be a small proportion, it gives us credibility to talk to our stakeholders and other people in industry. Say, look, we're trying really hard. What are you doing? How can we help you? How can we engage with you to take the industry on this journey and ultimately achieve net zero for the industry by 2050? So, I think it's about the industry working together, and everyone that works in the industry has a role to play, however big or small that is.
So this is interesting that you're saying, you're encouraging your airline partners to work with you. How are you working with your airline partners? Because two of your largest tenants, which is EasyJet and Wizz Air, themselves are, brandishing their sustainability credentials by saying EasyJet, working big on hydrogen for the future, and Wizz Air claims to be the greenest airline in Europe. How are you working with them?
So, as we mentioned earlier, we've got the ACA Level 4 Plus, and that part of that certification is very much about our plan to engage with stakeholders and how we're working together to drive reductions. So again, it's about working out where we can work together and the context. So in terms of in the industry in the UK, Gatwick is a member of Sustainable Aviation. Sustainable Aviation is an industry network and has published a net zero carbon roadmap, which the industry has signed up to. Is kind of, this is how the industry's view of how it is going to get to net zero. And so part of Sustainable Aviation, you've got aircraft manufacturers, you've got engine manufacturers, you've got airports, you've got, all the different various sectors in the industry represented. And so we're all working together. And that's the important thing. We've all signed up to get to this roadmap. And so Gatwick does what it can. So, for example, we've already demonstrated that SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, we can use it at Gatwick. Our infrastructure is ready to accept SAF and we can supply it. We also have demonstrated that we have the administrative, the bookkeeping, the book and claim system, as you earlier mentioned, in place. So that we're Gatwick is completely SAF ready. We can supply SAF. So the difficult bit is Gatwick doesn't use SAF and Gatwick doesn't buy SAF. We're sort of the middleman. So we've done what we can. So for example, we've during COP that was in Glasgow, we had some EasyJet flights which were fueled by SAF to show that it could be used. So we worked with QA and Neste as well as EasyJet on that. So we do what we can and we're working with industry.
It's interesting you mentioned SAF and that you're SAF ready. I'm glad to hear you're SAF ready. What are you doing beyond? Is Gatwick getting involved in potentially helping negotiate SAF contracts, working with SAF companies, or, for example, Amsterdam Schiphol has actually invested in a SAF company? Yeah. Is that something that's on the cards for you?
So SAF is really interesting point of view because, as I sort of mentioned, what is the role of an airport in the SAF agenda? Because, it's the airlines that buy the SAF and it's the manufacturers which provide the SAF. Gatwick is just the bit in the middle, really. So there's a framework called the Stargate framework, which is a European Commission framework, and it talks about it's basically a framework for actions that airports can take on SAF. So we have based our approach on the Stargate framework. So the things that we're looking at doing include, like you've suggested, how can we help increase the supply of SAF in the southeast of England? How can we engage with passengers? So do passengers understand about SAF if they're offsetting? If passengers are offsetting, do they understand they can buy offsets that include a proportion of SAF? We continue to advocate for greater support for SAF with government. And also we're sort of looking at partnerships where we can work together. So, those are the sorts of things we're doing. We're also looking at the way, potentially how we can incentivise airlines at Gatwick to use more SAF, and equally, there's a scheme called 30 by 30, which is trying to get corporate travel using 30% of SAF for all its flights by 2030. So there's quite an array of things that we can potentially do, and we're investigating all of those at the moment.
Mark, you mentioned this 30 by 30 initiative, which is for corporate flyers to buy 30% of SAF by 2030. How's Gatwick helping catalyze this goal? And
yes, so,
who's this led by?
So 30 by 30 is an international scheme. And the idea is to try and stimulate demand for SAF through business travel. So the idea is, if the demand is there, then the supply, you can get the market knows that the supply and the manufacturing can be put in place because the demand is there. So this covers corporate travel. So in terms of what Gatwick's trying to do is kind of, we're looking at our somewhat limited business travel by aviation. And so we would try and make sure that 30% of that is covered by SAF.
Okay, got it. It's very interesting. I would, I'll do some research and find out more about this initiative as well. Now let's talk about something that's core to Gatwick for a very long time, which is your dreams for a second runway. You have a second reserve runway that you want to activate. This obviously involves substantial growth of traffic into Gatwick, which increases your Scope 3 emissions by quite a lot. How does this tie in with your overall environmental impact?
Yeah. So the Northern Runway project, which I'll probably call NRP for ease from now on, is, we're just about to start the public hearing. That starts at the end of February. So it's imminent. And so that will be a 6-month planning process. And so as you rightly said, we do have a second runway already, which we use in reserve. And the idea is that we want to bring it into dual running. So when both runways are operating, the Northern Runway will be for takeoff only. And the current main runway will be for landing and takeoff. So we'll have dual operation. And the reason for the project is, before we can allow that dual operation to happen, the Northern Runway needs to move 12 metres north. So then there will be the safe distances apart, so we can have that dual operation. So all of the development is within the airport's current boundary. So we're not expanding the size of the airport physically in terms of its red line boundary at all. We're just moving the runway 12 metres north, and then, building other infrastructure to support the growth. So, there's lots of ways of looking at this. In terms of our net zero target, by 2030, growth of the airport has no impact whatsoever. Net zero is binary. We are either net zero or we're not. And once we are net zero, we will continue to be net zero. So net zero means driving down our emissions as far as possible, and then offsetting or actually removing any residual emissions. So by 2030, we'll have replaced all the boilers, replaced all the vehicles, and done what we can. So we'll only have those residuals that we talked about, the refrigerants, the de-icer, and the fire training. So that means any new assets that we build as part of the Northern Runway will be net zero compliant. They will have to be, and there is no going back from that. But as you said, as we've already discussed, most of the carbon emissions are from aviation. And so in the UK, the government has a strategy called the Jet Zero strategy. And so this is, as we talked about earlier, this is the government's plan for the aviation sector to get to net zero by 2050. And growth of the aviation industry is included as part of Jet Zero. So it should all be taken care of by this overarching strategy to get to 2050.
I hear you that any future development will be net zero, Scope 1 and Scope 2. But you can't unsee that, let's say, a second runway potentially helps double or triple the traffic in and out of Gatwick. That increases Scope 3 emissions substantially, because it is not in the short term that airlines can reduce their Scope 1 or your Scope 3 emissions. Doesn't that increase your entire carbon footprint by quite a lot in the end.
Yeah. So you're right. So there will be more emissions as a result of Northern Runway project, as part of our growth. But this is all taken care of in the Jet Zero strategy. So in terms of moving to zero emission flights, so things like hydrogen, electric flights, the use of SAF, all of that is taken account of in the Jet Zero strategy, which includes growth of the aviation industry in the UK.
Fair enough. And one of your key tenants, EasyJet, has very ambitious goals for hydrogen and electric-powered aircraft. How will you support them? For example, if they need hydrogen storage, do you have plans to build hydrogen storage, which can take a lot of space? Or if they bring in those electric aircraft, what about charging? Will you have charging points and charging ports? Are these studies being done currently by Gatwick, or is being done already with EasyJet? What's the plan there?
Yeah, so there's, again, we come back to this, is the aviation sector has to work together. So the airlines can't use hydrogen planes unless the airport that it takes off from and the airport that it lands at can do with hydrogen. So we have to work together, right? And it's a really interesting point. And so the approach that we take at Gatwick is we want to be Jet Zero ready. And what we mean by that is when an airline, be it EasyJet or whoever, says, right, we're going to start using hydrogen planes in 2038, and I'm just making these numbers up, dates up, we need to make sure that if they want to do it by 2030, we're ready, then we can supply them either with the hydrogen or the electricity that they want to use, because we need to make sure our infrastructure is ready for them. So in some ways, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. And we are working on some hydrogen approach, but unfortunately, we're not quite ready to announce what we're doing in the public domain. It will be coming shortly, so I can't share any details of that with you, unfortunately. And we've talked about what we're sort of doing in terms of SAF, but we are very much constantly looking at our infrastructure and how we need to be ready and engaging with those stakeholders to kind of say, right, so it's difficult because you sort of almost have this chicken and egg, because in some ways, Gatwick won't, who goes first and what is the first statement that prompts then all this, because all of this will require, development. So Gatwick doesn't want to build hydrogen infrastructure that then just sits there for 10 years unused. Equally, the airlines can't operate any planes unless there is hydrogen available. So we have to work together to work out what these timetables are. And obviously, a key part of that is the airline manufacturers and the technology as well. When will hydrogen planes be viable? And then even bigger picture, you get into the kind of, right, well, where does, in the UK, where does hydrogen come from? Because these plants are going to be huge. And if it's going to be truly green hydrogen, we're going to need renewable electricity sources to manufacture this hydrogen. So at a really macro scale, we need to make sure that there's sufficient renewable energy and sufficient hydrogen manufacturing available in the UK for all its uses, including aviation. And now we're getting into sort of big kind of policy government type issues. So you sort of can see it's really quite a complex thing to discuss. And we are trying to work out, we're working with everyone to work out, what we should be doing and when we should be doing it.
When you say you will be hydrogen or electric ready, are you working with suppliers or hydrogen fuel providers and producers to figure out what their needs are, for example?
We may well be, yes.
All right, I will be watching this space for sure, Mark, on what's going to happen here, because I'd be curious if we'll be producing some green hydrogen on site, or there might be some SAF production on site, some mobile carriers.
I think it's reasonable to say in terms of Gatwick. So we're an airport in the southeast of England, and we are very space constrained, and equally land is very expensive. So I think I'm probably safe to say it's unlikely we'll be seeing hydrogen production or SAF production on site at Gatwick anytime soon.
We will be watching this space for sure. Thank you.
Fair enough.
Thank you for diving in. Now, of course, we spoke about the future. Let's talk about the airport estate and your two terminals. Gatwick is not a new airport. It's been operational for decades. That means you have to deal with legacy buildings and old structures that were designed for a very different era. How are you making your buildings more sustainable?
Yeah, so absolutely. This is the difficult thing with Gatwick. It's an old airport, and so that it has grown up over many years. We've got building stock of very different ages, so it's something that we're continuously looking at. So I mentioned in terms of net zero, part of the reason that when we announced our net zero target, we also announced £250 million to get there as well. The reason why it's so expensive is we've got to go in and do the retrofitting of these buildings. And we'll be using different technologies in different places. So we might be using heat pumps, they might be air source, they might be ground source, we might be using electric boilers. We'll be looking at how we use our heat network that we've got and how we can get the most out of that. There are also potentially other opportunities for us to look at as well. So, is geothermal an opportunity? Can we tap into local heat networks which are outside of the airport? And then all of this is all about, actually, essentially to decarbonize, you need to electrify everything and make sure that electricity comes from renewable sources. So in some ways, is the electrical network at Gatwick ready for the increased volumes of electricity? So absolutely, getting our infrastructure and our buildings ready is a huge undertaking, and it's really complex. If we were a brand new airport with everything only 5 or 10 years old, it would be a completely different kettle of fish. But yeah, the age of the airport and its assets does add a level of complexity, and it's something that we are addressing on a daily basis and is fully built into our plans.
Okay, I'm glad to know that you're able to merge the old and the new together. Finally, something that is of importance in Europe and in the UK as well, which is noise. What are some of the things you are doing in terms of issues faced by a large airport like Gatwick when it comes to noise? Talk to us how actively you work with the local community around noise issues, and what is the plan to work these out?
Yeah, so absolutely, we understand that noise can be a problem for local people. It's a nuisance. That's why as part of our sustainability strategy, noise is one of our 10 key areas, and we have a specialist noise team working all the time. So absolutely, we recognise it's an issue. We also recognise that we're probably never going to be able to eliminate noise. So we need to work out how we're going to manage it. And how we can mitigate as far as possible. So we do work with our local communities. We have what's called a noise management board, where we actively engage with the local communities. We also have, in terms of our operating procedures, we restrict the noisiest aircraft from operating at night. And we also incentivise airlines to use their quietest aircraft at night as well. But there's a really interesting bit here, which I'm going to explain this, and it will probably seem counterintuitive. But actually, as time goes on, even if the airport grows, it's likely that our noise footprint will be smaller than it was in 2019. So we've got some modelling that shows that even if we increase flights by 2038, the noise footprint of all of those flights will be smaller than what it was in 2019. And one of the main reasons for that is the development of aircraft technology. In the aircraft are becoming much, much quieter. So as fleets are replaced, more and more of these new, quieter airplanes are being used. So it sounds sort of counterintuitive that we can grow and have more flights, but it will be quieter. But actually, the technology demonstrates that is the case. The other thing we're also doing is to work with our communities is we have a noise insulation scheme. So if you're impacted in a certain area, Gatwick provides funding for double glazing, that sort of thing.
That is quite interesting. the myriad of issues an airport has to deal with when it comes to overall sustainability, from noise, as we spoke about, to getting to net zero by 2030 operationally, to building, to be ready for electric and hydrogen powered planes in the future. It's the whole plethora of issues that you have to deal with. Are there any airports that you look up to when it comes to this work that you do, Mark?
Oh, wow.
That you feel are leading the space?
It's really interesting because, as I said earlier, I think the context is different for each airport. So for example, Schiphol in the Netherlands, they're really strong on the circular economy. And that's, the Netherlands as a whole is really good on the circular economy. So they, always come out top there, and, they have some really good case studies and examples of things they're doing. So I think it depends on the issues. I think in the UK in particular, for example, we've just been talking about noise. I think the UK is probably an epicenter for noise, and is probably a beacon of how to manage noise internationally. Also at Gatwick, we're pretty good at the social side of things, and it seems sort of within aviation, other than things like noise and nuisance, kind of maybe the social agenda isn't as quite as well progressed and understood. So it kind of depends. There are some things, in terms of water, some of the hotter European countries are really doing a lot of stuff about water efficiency. But some of the things that they're doing is kind of, well, that wouldn't be applicable to the UK and it doesn't work, those sorts of things. So it's really difficult. I'm not trying to have slopey shoulders and not give you an answer, but it really does depend on the particular sustainability topic. And then also you have to kind of contextualize as well. So it basically means we're very busy always looking at other airports and seeing what they're doing.
I'm glad. And I think your ACA achievement is commendable. You're learning, and I think you're inspiring other airports as well. And I'm sure a lot of listeners will learn a thing or two or more from this podcast as well. Now, the final bit of this podcast is what I call the rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally. So I'll ask you simple one-line questions, and you have to give me the first answer that comes to your mind. Okay?
Okay.
So here we go. We'll start easy. What's your favorite city?
Cripes. Either Stockholm or Edinburgh, or maybe London.
Oh, no, you got to give me one. That's too many.
Stockholm.
All right, Stockholm it is. Favorite movie?
Too many. Probably Heat, directed by Michael Mann.
Okay, fair enough. What about your favorite airline?
I genuinely do not have a favourite airline. When I travel in Europe, I try and go by train as far as I can. So I genuinely don't have a favourite airline at all.
Okay, while we are at it, do you calculate or keep a track of your own carbon footprint when traveling?
Yep. So
do you offset it?
Yep, and I do the 30% SAF as well.
Okay, fantastic. Are you required to, or do you do this by yourself?
No, so I'm talking about personal travel, so holidays, nothing to do work. We do work as well, so yeah, in my personal life.
Who do you use to buy this SAF personally?
So normally I try and go through the airlines, depending on what they've got. So that's because you can buy that as part of the ticket buying process. So that's generally what I try and do.
Okay, got it. Well, this is quite commendable. Well done. What's your favorite book, Mark?
I'm going to say The Flavor Thesaurus by Nikki Segnet.
I'm going to check it out. This is a new one for me. What is something that you want to learn?
Slightly ridiculous. I'm not very adept at using chopsticks, so I'd love to be like a chopstick wizard.
Have you seen those trainer chopsticks for kids?
Yeah,
yes. They have those rings. That's what my kids were given in London recently, and I thought, this is brilliant. You can learn how to use chopsticks.
Yeah.
Using those. I don't know if they have adult sizes in those rings, but give it a shot. How about something that you do in your free time?
Probably eat, or think about what I'm going to eat, or cook what I'm going to eat.
Okay, all right. Food. Finally, what's the best advice you've received, Mark?
Probably, well, there's lots, but assume every email you ever send, the world can read it.
Absolutely. Yes. Comms 101.
Yeah.
every email is a tweet. And that's how you can put it. This is very interesting. If you were on a long-haul flight from Gatwick, let's say to Singapore, which is starting soon, Gatwick to Singapore on Singapore Airlines, who would you like to be seated next to for that super long-haul flight?
Oh, wow. Does it have to be a living person? Can we choose from history?
It can be living or dead.
Oh, right. Wow. Well, do you know what? I saw Oppenheimer at the cinema last year, and it would be fascinating to sit next to Oppenheimer and discuss all of that with him. That would be amazing.
What would you ask him? I'm not curious.
It's the bit about unleashing change on the world, through which you can never go back. And I see sustainability is kind of also unleashing change on the world. And so I'm fascinated by that. I think it's even though ostensibly because not only was it about the nuclear bomb, it also started the era of nuclear power, which is huge. So it's a huge societal change, and it's sort of those sorts of things which we need to get to a fully sustainable future. So I'd be fascinated to explore that with him.
Right. Very, very interesting. And finally, if we are speaking 1 year from today and we are popping champagne, what are we celebrating?
Oh, wow. So I'm sure some people at Gatwick would be wanting to say that we've definitely got the Northern Runway project. But for me, personally, I think that we're well on our way to achieving our net zero, and that we've passed a milestone in terms of replacing some of those boilers, and also that sustainability at Gatwick is really embedded into the way that Gatwick does business, and that everyone at Gatwick feels that they have a role to play to making Gatwick and the aviation industry more sustainable.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. I loved how we ended this, and I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our supervising editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.